Okay, this chapter, it's all about Andrew Jackson. Whole thing is basically about Andrew Jackson. Um, because Andrew Jackson's such an important president. I mean, yeah, maybe. Yes. The answer is yes. Is he like? Does he do a genocide? Absolutely. Is he like not someone you'd want to hang around with? Absolutely. Is he someone that you wouldn't want to be your enemy? Absolutely. Is he petty, 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 petty? Absolutely. Um, and he's important because he is around at a time when there's a real fundamental shift in power, right? So Jackson isn't. This is the important thing when people talk about the age or the era of Andrew Jackson. He didn't do any of this stuff, right? He is a product of a national uh, uh, um, trend that look the idea of like the common people, the demos, and in this time period it means white men. The idea of them having the power that's not new, right? Daniel Shays was talking about that. They were talking about that when they were having their purposeful crowd actions in the Revolutionary period. Thomas Jefferson was talking about that. So he's just kind of the culmination of all this stuff. As an important or kind of interesting, I guess, historical note, the word condescend, I'm sure you know, it means like, someone looking down on you, patronizing of you, whatever. The word condescend used to have a good meaning. I mean, like in the 1500s, to condescend was good. So if someone of a higher station, a noble, a lord, an aristocrat, like got off their wagon or their horse and said like, "Oi, you peasant, where's the public house or where's the castle or whatever?" Um, that was pretty cool. They condescended to you, right? Like they came down to your level. And that was a nice thing. Hey, the noble condescended to me. It's not a nice word anymore. And that shift, right, is something you like, how dare you kind of thing. Like, who are you to condescend to me? That shift in meaning is all about democracy. It's all about this idea of, when we have strict social hierarchy, aristocracy, feudalism, whatever, a word like that is not nice. I got something that's not nice in my glasses here, too. I can't see anything. With the advent of democracy and the rise of the kind of rhetoric of equality, a word like that becomes a bad word. So Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson is that transition happens over the course of 100 years or so. But when we look at Andrew Jackson, it's that I start with that story to kind of show you how a transition happens from the notables, people saying, "Oh, the governor, politicians should be elites." That's part of republicanism, is you have people who are best to lead, to like, no, anyone can do it, even some old hick veteran who doesn't want to be president anyway. All right, so before we talk about him, let's talk about any drama. You got to set up some conflict here. So the conflict is between Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. He is ancient by the time he dies. He's around, like John Marshall is around for a long time. Henry Clay around for a long time. The Great Compromiser. Um, is one of his titles, and I'll give a little lecture in class about the most famous compromise of his, maybe the Missouri Compromise, and we'll have a little exercise about what it means to call it a compromise versus, say, appeasement. Anyway, Henry Clay runs for president a bunch of times, never wins. He's from Kentucky. He's a Whig. He kind of harvests the organs and limbs of the destroyed Federalist Party and pieces it back together, Dr. Frankenstein-like, into a new party called the Whigs. He advocates what he calls the American system. It's basically just like a reheated version of what Hamilton called the American school. That is to say, protective tariffs, which help industry, largely in the Northeast. Nascent means like fledgling. If that doesn't help, it means like little. or emerging. National bank, got to keep that economy rolling, got to have a centralized banking system to keep the economy running smoothly. High enough public land prices. Remember, there's not tons of sources of revenue for the government. Tariffs is one and land sales is another. So that keeps revenue going. And then internal improvements, this helps people in the West, people in the South to some degree, depending on where you are in the South. Some Southerners don't like internal improvements. And that's an important point here. This time period in particular is very confusing. We're like, well, wait a minute. This person's a Jacksonian, but they supported the tariff, but then Jackson doesn't support the tariff. Look, man, it's complicated. That's something to be happy with the kind of like garbage dump fire that we have in the modern American two-party system, is that like it's pretty easy to know where people stand on things. In this time period, you got, the Whigs run 4 people for president. What? And they're going to split up the electoral college. It's complicated. It's not a government class. It's not a college class on Andrew Jackson. So we can just do the highlights here. I'm in the way of my own meme. Herrenvolk Republicanism. I want to talk about this very briefly. The white worker, the laboring white man, has always played a central role. God bless them, white men. They've played a central role in American history, from republicanism through anti-federalism, Jeffersonian democracy, and now Jacksonian democracy. And the term, fancy term, but important one, to talk about this time period beyond just Jeffersonian democracy or the Jeffersonian era, is this term Herrenvolk Republicanism. This is a term, it's actually from a historian, David Rediger, who writes his whole career is based on researching and writing about this time period. Herrenvolk Republicanism is a spin on a concept that is also uses the word Herrenvolk. Herrenvolk is like people, it's German. Right, like common folk, or like or whatever. Herrenvolk. Herrenvolk democracy is like South Africa was a Herrenvolk democracy. The Jim Crow South could be considered a Herrenvolk democracy. This is where like it's a government that's ostensibly a democracy, but it's kind of like all for like one race. Right? That's Herrenvolk democracy. Herrenvolk republicanism is similar. Except it's more about like Republican virtue. So it's not about like everyone having a say in the society, and then the people who actually benefit are like the white people or something. This is like a Herrenvolk Republic is more comfortable with hierarchy, right? It is about white supremacy over free and enslaved. So this is an important point here when we talk about this time period, is to say that how to put this, if you were an abolitionist, say, that doesn't mean you're not racist, right? So there are plenty of abolitionists who are racist. And it also means that in terms of like the way that white workers feel, they feel better than the enslaved. Obviously, they think they're superior to the enslaved, but they also think they're better than just black people, period, right? Because there's this binary logic that comes into play with like, white is better than black. Freedom is better than servility. This is just old school republicanism, right? This is part of the whole idea of republicanism, is you can't have people who are servile. You need to have, each person needs to be fully independent, free. That's why they're so like uncomfortable with wages, right? So anyway, white over black, freedom over servility. So this basically kind of mutates into this idea of, it's not just that they don't like slavery, they just don't like black people, period. That it's not just like slavery, enslaved labor is a threat to Republican working wages or power, but just anyone who's black, enslaved, free, or otherwise. So this is an important twist here, because it's a twist on like how racism works, right? This is an introduction of a class element into white supremacy, right? So like Thomas Jefferson is a white supremacist, and he says like, oh yeah, he loves the common people or whatever, but there's a certain hierarchy to his thinking. This is a kind of democratizing of white supremacy, but the important point is that whiteness begins to matter more. Who is considered white begins to matter more, especially if you're working class. You think John Adams cares about whiteness? He doesn't care about that. There's no doubt about it, right? Like he's like an insulated, wealthy New Englander, like his ancestors came over on the Mayflower. He's not concerned about like advocating for his own whiteness. If you're a working class Irish and you're like white but not quite, because the Irish aren't really considered white at this time period, your whiteness really, really matters. And you're saying, I am free, I'm a Republican, I have freedom, I'm not like those people, right? So suddenly the thing that differentiates you most, right, if you have it, is white skin. So this is this idea of Herrenvolk republicanism, and it helps as a framing metaphor. It helps us to understand all of the complicated things that are happening in this time period. Okay, Jackson's origin story. Let's learn about that. He is born in what's called Waxhaw Settlement, 1767. This is before the Revolution, obviously. That's on the North Carolina-South Carolina border. It's a community. I'm giving you a little bit of like the psychoanalysis here because it matters. It's a community that is under constant threat by Native Americans because it's their land and they don't want people killing them. So constant threat of Native Americans. So he grows up with that kind of that ideology, right? Native Americans, bad, get rid of them, do a genocide. He's also, Waxhaw Settlement is connected to Charleston via a kind of overland road. Charleston is about as southern as it gets, especially in the 1760s, right? Because we don't have the Deep South yet. So he's southern. Right, Andrew Jackson, we often always Tennessee, right? He's a Westerner. He's in all these duels or whatever. Really, we only know of 3 duels, just for the record. One of them, they like buried the hatchet, as it were. One of them, he bodied someone, and then one of them, he got shot and had a bullet lodged very close to his heart. His whole life, and some historians have said that's why he was such a like mean person, because he was in like constant pain. I'm not trying to make you feel bad for the guy, but I'm just saying that's the history. Southern, also Western, right? So in terms of his worldview, right, Andrew Jackson's worldview, there's this sense that, oh, he's a Westerner. Yeah, sure, but he grew up in a pretty southern place, right? Connected to Charleston, it's about as southern as it gets. He don't want to run for president. He runs for president. Because he marries into a political family and they say he should do it. He's a war hero, 1812, all that. Doesn't want to do it. He's old. He's a geezer in 1824. Does it, thinks he gets, a bum deal or a corrupt bargain, as he would put it. The electoral votes are split up. He has the most popular votes, and I think he has the most electoral votes too. Is that right? And then John Quincy Adams is in second, and Henry Clay is in third. Clay says he'll throw his weight behind Adams it gets kicked to the House of Representatives, the 12th Amendment of the Constitution here, and it's a corrupt bargain. He feels he gets a bum deal, and because he petty, he's gonna dedicate the next 4 years to running, and he does, and he wins. One little thing here that I want to kind of push back on in your book on page 293 says that it was Jackson and Taney. Taney is the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice that Jackson appoints. That because of what they did, all of these states started taking away the property requirements and letting all these poor whites vote. That ain't true. Sorry. Some states, yes, some states reform their constitutions after Jackson is elected. But how do you think he got elected? Right? The states, especially Western states, were already removing property qualifications in the early 1820s. Right? So, before 1828 when he gets elected. These Western states are doing that because they want people to move there. Right? So they know that all of these Eastern states have property qualifications. They want people to move to help exterminate Native Americans, expropriate their land, also get more representation in Congress. So they take away the property requirements and poor people flood west. So again, I'm not saying your book is wrong. Yes, surely other states were inspired by the kind of spirit of the time, but they didn't start it. Jackson, again, and this is a pretty widely understood historical consensus here, that again, Jackson is a product of the time period. He's not the prime mover of all of the stuff that's happening. He is the kind of a effect, not a cause. Indian removal. So we're going to talk about 3 key moments in Jackson's presidency: Indian removal, the nullification crisis, and the bank veto. That's the biggies, man. You don't need to know all that other stuff. Indian removal begins in the 1830s. Indian Removal Act. Again, he develops his psychology growing up in Waxhaw settlement. He develops his psychology fighting the Seminoles in Florida, a pretty brutal, again, like genocidal campaign against the Seminoles. So, you know, there's a thing in your book where it's like, well, what was Andrew Jackson? Was he a humanitarian, or was he like, he wasn't a humanitarian? Again, some historians, I think the book is from 1983. I don't know the author, but he didn't care for Native Americans. It's pretty, we can say with some confidence he didn't care for Native Americans. And that's putting it very, in a very genteel way. Indian Removal Act, 1830. Trail of Tears is 1838. That's not on his watch, right? That's Martin Van Buren's doing. But because he's so associated with Indian removal, we often associate Jackson with the actual Trail of Tears. He gets the ball rolling, but it actually happens under Van Buren's watch. Okay, very important point. This is simply one dramatic instance of a policy that is ongoing, right? We can go back to the Pequod War or Metacom or the Algonquins, you name it. The extermination, forced removal of Native Americans, the expropriation of native land is not new. This is just a dramatic point that we remember. And why do we remember the Trail of Tears? This is something that's important when we're thinking historically, because it testifies to this larger history. It is like a prime example of an ongoing policy, right? So we make a historical mistake when we see it like as a singular event. It's not singular. It's a exemplification of a larger trend, right? That's why that's why we study it. Very long trip. Thousands of people die. I think your book actually says 3,000. It's a lot of people. People die in camps. People died during the march. But why did it happen? It shouldn't have happened. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. This is, again, still John Marshall. He's still around. That decision defines the Cherokee Nation as what is called in Marshall's words, a domestic dependent nation. So they are a nation that is dependent, that like a nation within a nation, right? A domestic dependent. 1831, Worcester versus Georgia a year later defines them as sovereign. Those aren't contradictory, right? So like, to use an analogy, I don't know what kind of home life you have, but like if one lives with one's parents and one has like a certain amount of autonomy to do what they want in their room, right? Like slam the door. I don't know what kind of dumb stuff you do, right? Like, this is my room, no parents allowed. Like, that's an idea of like you're a domestic dependent. Like you've got, like, you're in the house, but you also, right, Worcester versus Georgia, have some amount of sovereignty, right? Like you can't, I don't know, get like all your stuff sold, like can't sell all your stuff away or like throw your books out or I don't know what, right? Like, so it's this idea of you are sovereign, you have some amount of independence, but you're a sovereign nation within a nation, right? So they're not necessarily contradictory. Jackson don't care. He gets rid of them anyway. This is, whether it's true or not, the quote is something along the lines of like, oh, Marshall has made his law, now let's see him enforce it. He doesn't care, right? Supreme Court says can't do it, just does it anyway. His policy, unlike Thomas Jefferson and many other politicians of the previous generation, the idea was that it would be amalgamation, right? Native American and an English, an immigrant coming together and making a new nation, not for Jackson or the people of Jackson's era. It's all about extermination, exile, push them out, get rid of them, break treaties. We will, if we have time, study a recent Supreme Court decision that's relevant to this, at least to where the Native Americans go in Oklahoma. Supreme Court decision that actually ruled that a lot of Oklahoma actually is still native land. All right. It's been 20 minutes. I've done only one moment of Jackson's presidency. And just for the sake of appearances, I want to keep these videos at 20 minutes. So I'm going to stop and I'll come back with the Act 2 of Andrew Jackson. What if they made a play about Andrew? Why doesn't Lin-Manuel Miranda do that next? Make a hip opera about Andrew Jackson. I'm sure that won't be a big hit. All right, more soon.